Okay, please go ahead. Please. Acha, okay. This is what we'll be discussing today, right? This is what we'll be discussing today. Okay. So, see, two or 3 points that we are going to discuss today. That is what generally we know as Royal Lenin debate, and that pertains to the national and colonial question. So that is one. Primarily that is linked to the understanding that if communist revolution can be possible in colonial countries, or if proletariats as a class, they were ready for a revolution in a colonial country like India. So it's the whole idea of late capitalism is related to that. So I will discuss that, and along with that, we will come to the discussion on M.N. Roy's critique of Gandhian method. So somehow, we would see that, how they would be connected, because Roy would understand that, possibly whole Gandhian approach was to safeguard the interest of the bourgeois class in India. I mean, of course, that would be a typical Marxist position, right? So that is the second issue that we intend discussing, and finally we'll try to discuss his whole idea of new democracy or the radical democratic state, his idea on radical democratic state, and the concept on which it is based is his understanding of radical humanism or new humanism. So this is what we intend doing. Now, the point we were trying to discuss yesterday, that as far as M.N. Roy would be concerned, in his understanding, the communist state or a parliamentary democracy would mean that individual would not have any freedom in those kinds of political regimes. So that is something which remains the pressing problem, in M.N. Roy's pressing problem in M.N. Roy's thought and his overall approach. But when he was close to Marxism as a member of Mexican Communist Party, and that is how he had become part of the international communist movement. So that is where he was asked by Lenin to prepare a draft thesis on national and colonial question. So the whole issue was linked to the relationship between metropolitan states meaning that primarily the imperial powers like Britain in the case of India, and the colonial states. Now, it would be understood that as far as the colonial states were concerned, they had not reached the required level of capitalist development wherein the proletariat could emerge as a conscious class. And that is what would be a requirement for a successful proletariat revolution. I'm not going into the whole theory of Marxist revolution, but this is how it would be in Marxist theory, that capitalism is required to attain its full development, and it is at that stage that the proletariats, they attain consciousness, and once they become a conscious class, then they can wage a revolution against the capitalist class, and that's how the destruction of capitalist class and destruction of capitalism would become possible, and eventually it would lead to the establishment of socialism and finally communism, which would be a classless and a stateless society. Now, this is what is linked to the whole understanding of late capitalism. Now, it would be understood, and this is what was the case with Russia, and when Lenin and his comrades, they had created the political party for the sake of capturing power. And this is how, Roy would criticize them, that, it was primarily for the sake of capturing power that the party had been created. And the party which was created for the purpose of capturing power would do nothing but would pursue power as an objective, pursue power as an end in itself, rather than considering it as a means for the larger objective of freedom for the individuals, freedom for the people. So this is what would not happen in M. N. Roy's understanding, in M. N. Roy's thinking. Now, Russia was a country in 1917 when revolution had occurred. The level of capitalism was not mature enough where it would have a large industrial base and the working class would form the sizable number to form a formidable class to carry out a revolution. But at the same time, what had happened that the capitalists, they were a class which was unstable, which was caught in contradiction. So the whole understanding of late capitalism is related to the idea that as far as the bourgeoisie is concerned, maybe the level of capitalist development is not high in a particular country, but bourgeoisie emerges and as a class, and the emergence of bourgeoisie is rather late on the scene. Now, at the same time, the bourgeoisie is also not a class which would have consolidated its position to become a powerful dominant force, right? So this is how the whole understanding of late capitalism would be looked at. So Germany was an example, right, where the capitalist development was rather late in a sense that all those structures of capitalist economy would grow only in a significant manner at a later stage rather than at a point when possibly the Communist Party would think that revolution can be carried out. So this is how Lenin had applied the understanding of late capitalism in the case of Russia or in the case of Germany, right? So the level of capitalist development would not be significant enough so that the structures would be matured. But at the same time, bourgeoisie would emerge as a class on the scene. But the position of the bourgeoisie would not be strong enough, or position of bourgeoisie would not be consolidated to a significant extent to make it a stable and powerful and dominant class. So this is how one would look at the whole aspect of late capitalism. Now, what Lenin thought that as far as the colonial countries were concerned, so in colonial countries there were nationalist movements which were being carried out by the leadership which would be drawn from the bourgeois class, according to Lenin. And this would be considered to be a bourgeois revolution. And this would be considered by Lenin to be an important stage in the realization of communism in colonial countries. Because in Lenin's understanding, unless this happens, the growth of capitalism would not happen to the extent which would throw proletariats as a formidable class with a sizable number to bring out the revolution on their own. So that is where the role of the bourgeoisie would be considered to be important in Lenin's view. And that is where he would understand that, in the case of India, he would, in his thesis on colonial and national question, would propose that the proletariats or the working classes, they were supposed to extend support to the bourgeois class in this revolution, meaning that, in their fight against the colonial rule. And once that happens, then the socialist revolution can happen only at a later stage, when capitalist mode of development had grown and it had acquired certain level of maturity. This is how Lenin would view as far as situation in India would be concerned, or as far as situation in colonial countries like India would be concerned. But Emin Roy would differ with Lenin, on this specific account, and that is where he proposed his alternate thesis. And in his understanding, that the whole approach of extending support to the bourgeois class during the national movement would be meaningless, primarily because this would give an opportunity to the bourgeoisie to consolidate their position. And this would also not allow the proletariats to consolidate their position as a class in contradiction to the bourgeoisie. So what Roy would propose that, if one looks at a country like India at that point of time, which was a colony of the British, so the bourgeoisie, it was caught in a dual contradiction. And in his understanding, the working classes of the proletariats could have taken advantage of the contradiction in which bourgeoisie had been caught. Right? Now, the point was that capitalism had not developed in India. There were no sound industrial base, and the number of working classes were very small as far as India was concerned. So certainly this was not the right kind of condition, in Marxism, when revolution possibly could happen. Now, in M.N. Roy's understanding, that as far as the then bourgeois class was concerned, or then the emerging capitalist class in India was concerned, right? So it was caught in dual contradiction. One, in terms of its contradiction with the feudal class at that point of time. So that would be one contradiction, that possibly one can look at. And another would be with the rising working classes. Now, what Emil Roy would rather propose, that this was the right time wherein the workers or the proletariats, which would include peasants as well, which would include farmers as well. It's right. This is how the whole approach would not rely upon the number of the working classes alone. Rather, the peasants and the farmers, or the tenants, for instance, who were landless, who were also workers in some sense, they could have been brought under the larger class of the proletariats. And since bourgeoisie would be caught in this dual contradiction, then what would happen during the national movement would be polarization of the classes. And the size of the proletariats, it would grow during the national movement, and the rising polarization would give an opportunity to the proletariats to wage a revolution directly against the colonial powers and capture the state power. So this is how he understood that revolution still was possible in a country like India, which was under the colonial rule. But of course, later on, Emin Roy develops differences with Lenin, and he was expelled out of the international communist movement. And of course, later on, Emin Roy, he gets dissatisfied with the way Soviet state emerges as a dictatorship, and especially the ruthlessness that happens during the Stalin's regime. That is something which makes Emin Roy to get disillusioned with the whole communist idea. And then he decides to return to India, wherein he would be associated with Indian National Congress for almost 10 years, and after that he would also establish a party which would be known as Radical Democratic Party. But later on he also abandons, and then he starts developing his whole approach and idea on radical humanism. But this is how the whole debate is related as far as the national and colonial question in Emin Roy's thinking. That is concerned. The way he counters the argument of Lenin, and later on, due to his differences, owing to his differences with Lenin, he had to come back to India, right? But that is. Tell me. Okay. See, the dual contradiction that I referred to, right? So bourgeoisie anyway would be in contradiction with the